Very well. Please take your seats so that we can get started with our panel. As you know, during this session, we're going to be discussing the fascinating subject of what is happening in Cuba and what is happening following the changes in the relations between Cuba, the United States, and Latin America. Just a few days ago, at a conference in London, an attendee asked me, "What do you think of the world?" And I reacted irrationally and quickly, and I said, the world today is a very, very fragile space, a very complex one, going through a transition, and it's hard to govern. And the truth is, I wasn't all that bad in giving that definition. And if you look at Cuba's history in the overall context, in the context of the Cold War, and then the subsequent years, and if you examine Cuba's isolation from the rest of Latin America, plus the very complicated relationship that it had with the United States, you can say with certain optimism that what has happened is the demonstration of something that was raised in the panel on development, i.e., that it is possible to establish a dialogue and to reach a consensus. And the thing is, there's a time for everything. But I'm sure that in this panel we're going to be able to examine the important changes that have taken place, and of course some doubts, some question marks that are still with us. We have a very illustrious panel with us, and we have reached a consensus on the way we're going to conduct this panel. First of all, I'm going to ask Rebeca Grynspan to speak. She requires no introduction. She was vice president of her country, Costa Rica. She was the director of UNDP, and now she is the general secretary of the Ibero-American General Secretariat, SEGIB, which is one of the very few spaces where, since the Declaration of Guadalajara, Cuba is a member. Cuba joined that Ibero-American space, and it has played a very important role. Several of us have attended Ibero-American summits in Havana. So, Rebeca, tell us about your vision of Cuba today, what you think of Cuba's economy. I think that that would be very useful and would help us get our discussion started. Thank you, Guillermo. First of all, I want to thank CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue, the Organization of American States, for getting us all here together today. I want to say hello to Enrique Garcia and Michael Shifter. All of us attend the CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue events, like we go to the doctor for a checkup every year. We come to look at structural issues. We're happier to come here than going to the doctor, of course, but it is a good way to get together, to see each other, to analyze the region, and this has been a very considerable contribution to this dialogue, as was said yesterday. So once again, I congratulate all of those involved. Now, regarding the issue that we are to discuss, I only wanted to emphasize what Guillermo said, and that is since 1991, which was the first Ibero-American Summit, this is our 25th anniversary, Colombia has been a full-fledged member of the Ibero-American Secretariat. So I wanted to say that the first thing that we have to do is celebrate the reestablishment of diplomatic agreements between Cuba and the United States. They're talking about regularizing their relationships, and that has provided for better organization between Cuba and the rest of Latin America, because Latin America for a long time has been in favor of including Cuba in the OAS and other fora, and it was a very drastic split with the position of the U.S. administration. So once again, we want to celebrate the reestablishment of relations and the administrative measures that have been taken, and we realize that this is a process because, of course, the embargo, the Helene-Sputin law are still in place, but we hope that there will be a process so that in the long run we will see the elimination of both of these things. Plus, Cuba has become a reason for union in the region. And I think that that too is an important point to put on the table. So bringing unity to the hemisphere, unity in Latin America. Also, for example, its role in reaching a peace accord with in Colombia. That, too, is a role that needs to be emphasized. I know that there will be a panel. Yesterday, Marta Lucia expressed her opinions regarding the peace agreement, but I have to say quite emphatically that I think that it's one of the elements, along with normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations, that is more important, most important, and most positive events that we have seen in Latin America in recent years. So I think that both of those events are historic. And then the third thing that I want to say is that I'm going to be talking a bit about the evolution that we have seen in Cuba. But I think that we can benefit if we get away from the temptation of seeing this in a binary way. In other words, only regarding the transition towards a radically different model, both politically and economically. And if we try to truly weigh what changes we have seen and look at the intrinsic value of those changes, taking into account Cuba's reality. So, allow me to begin first by saying that Cuba today is a very different country, and I say that because I was also director for Central America, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Haiti when I was at ECLAC, and consequently I dealt in depth with Cuba's economy. Cuba today is a society, an economy that is quite different from the economy that we all remember from the special period. I'm very quickly going to mention 4 elements to give this as an example. First of all, I think that we have to acknowledge that there has been a demographic change in Cuba. The fact that there's a very low birth rate, along with the migration following the decree of 2013, if I'm not mistaken, right, Vilma, opening up migration, that introduced a very important element and led to the aging of the population of Cuba. Most studies show that by 2025, the Cuban population will drop by 1 million people, and that is a key element and an important one to understand the way that young people are doing in Cuba. That is a key challenge that the island faces. Also, there have been many changes since 2008 regarding the diversification of the economy, as well as different projects in Cuba. Right now, there are like 1 million people that are basically involved in the private sector. This is an important shift. This is not marginal. It is a change that has accelerated, and we have seen that there has been an acceleration of the people that are self-employed, and also foreign investment in education. There are 3 sectors that are excluded: education, defense. The other sectors are open to foreign investment. We have 33% more self-employed in Cuba than we had at the end of the special period. And the last important element of change within Cuba's reality is the shrinkage of the public sector. Between 2010 and 2015, the estimate is that the state sector decreased by 10 percentage points from 71 to 61%. Very important elements from last year because of the political events that I think require emphasis. The first event was renegotiation of Cuba's external debt with the Paris Club, where a certain amount was forgiven. This allowed improvement of the financial and credit standing of the island. There was forgiveness of the debt of 8.5 billion. So the idea is that Cuba can now become a member of CAF. I think that that is something that also needs to be highlighted. The agreements with Germany, with Mexico, with France, with Spain, even with Spain, setting up a fund in Cuban pesos so as to be able to co-finance foreign investment. That is a new mechanism that I think is well worth highlighting. Then second, the major change in the sector of tourism and also remittances. These are positive things. According to figures from the Ministry of Tourism, the number of tourism coming from the United States was up by 84% in mid-2016, 84%. Also, there is an increase in visitors from countries that have traditionally gone as tourists. Spaniards are up by 69%, Germany's up by 41%. So we're talking about very significant figures that, of course, represent a challenge in terms of investment, but this is an element that makes the economy very dynamic and positive, and that explains the fact of including Airbnb as another important element. And I'm close to concluding. Now, these regulatory changes in financial terms, in the area of tourism, also airlines flying into the country, boats, all of that, according to Bill and Morris, can mean something like 1% of Cuba's GDP for Cuba. And then remittances, $2 million per year, and you can see an ascending trend in terms of remittances. So problems, right? So those were the good things. Now let's turn to the problems. This year there is going to be very low growth, 4.3% last year. This year close to 1%, according to positive estimates on Cuba. It once again is clear that the matter of energy and remittances continue to be very important constraints on potential growth in Cuba. And of course, in its favor, it has a highly educated labor force, science and technology sector that can be very successful, but there are still major difficulties in terms of energy as well as availability of foreign exchange, despite all of the positive things I mentioned. We hear that there has been 40% growth in sending of crude to the island, and measures have been announced where they are cutting back on the public sector in Cuba. And this contradicts the evolution of the last 5 years, where energy consumption in Cuba increased by 30% in recent years. The investment level is still close to 10% of the GDP, and that is a major stumbling block in terms of being able to build up the infrastructure needed to address needs in Cuba. Spain is still the main investor, followed by the European countries. Then a third aspect is the difficulty to unify the exchange rate. There are very important repercussions since they have a multiplicity of exchange rates, and that stands in the way of investment and regularization, normalization. But we have to be careful because those that are tied to activities in hard currency would profit from unifying the exchange rate. But most of the labor force is still linked to the Cuban peso, and consequently, without major external flows of funding, the possibility of Cuba being able to unify its exchange rate is still a serious problem. And that is why, despite the willingness to do so, they have not been able to unify the exchange rate. And then lastly, and to conclude, migration. Who is migrating? Young people. And also there has been an increase in migration since borders have opened up. The new provisions for the self-employed and for small companies, most new entrepreneurs are young people, and that may help lessen this problem. But given that demographic change, the fact that these are young people and the talented people that are leaving is necessarily a problem. And I conclude, now we have to pay attention to telecommunications and energy, especially over the next couple of years, and the matter of institutional capacity to process change. And here, my final thought. In Latin America, I would say that many of our countries are currently facing a situation where the society and the economy have evolved more quickly than the political system and institutions. Institutions have lagged behind the social changes and the economic changes experienced by many of our countries. Cuba is no exception. Institutional changes required to process everything that I have mentioned take much longer and are much more difficult. They require greater political consensus than the strides made by society. Society is outpacing those changes. And I think that the analysis that we will make into the future will see how these two things will influence each other and lead to more balanced and harmonious development in future years. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hizo la tarea divinamente.
Now you understand why she is the secretary of the SEGIB. I would like to highlight two of the issues mentioned. Undoubtedly, the fact that Cuba finds itself in this process and relations with the United States have normalized, ended with other excuses to engage in mature and sensible dialogue between the United States and Latin America. Cuba used to be the ever use the excuse preventing that dialogue from being constructive. And so I think this is a significant point. The second issue is, it's like a commercial, but it is related to Vilma. Vilma Hidalgo is the vice president of the University of Havana, and she has been a great ally of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, for all the work we've done with the university and the work we've done in Cuba. And I will share a couple secrets. They are no longer secrets because nothing is secret anymore. First is that CAF, since 2013, has been working, and it has been discreetly doing so under the leadership of Enrique and following directions from our directors. Our dear Mario Bergara, president of the central bank, had the opportunity as the chairman of the board of directors to accompany us along with this. He is a guest because he lived through this process internally in our institution. We have had wonderful meetings in Havana with economists of Latin America. We also have had other professors, our forum of economists in Spain, and Spain is part of our bank as well as Portugal. It is an Ibero-American bank. There is a historic link with Cuba. Spain has been present over the years in the island, especially in so far as tourism promotion. President Garcia signed an agreement, a cooperation agreement vis-a-vis the fragmentation. It's better to have more integration, and vis-a-vis fragmentation, it is important than an institution such as CAF to be able to play the role to promote integration, sustainable development, and facilitate social and economic well-being in Latin America and the Caribbean. For us, Cuba is both Latin American and Caribbean, and we have decided to support them. But we signed, President Garcia signed with COFIDES, which is the Spanish financing corporation, signed a technical cooperation agreement for something that we consider essential, which is for capacity building for workers who are linked to Spanish companies working in Cuba. This is one of the great concerns, and I'm bringing it up here because it has been a great development, very positive for us, that an agreement has been signed between Cuba and Spain, and with the assistance of CAF in this field. Vilma, I'm sure you will tell us many things that many people want to hear about, in particular how each time the process will continue to improve. You have a vision, and not only as the vice president of the university, but in your other capacities as well. Thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you in this very important event. I would like to thank CAF and Enrique Garcia personally, who has made a big effort to invite Cuban academics to this forum. And I will also join my voice to congratulating the people from CAF and the Central Bank of Cuba and the people involved. I think this agreement will be very important in the future to supplement the development agenda we have started. I would like to focus my remarks giving you some history, and I will be in agreement with many of the things that Rebecca has mentioned, but from the perspective of academia in Cuba, and I should say that academia in Cuba has had a great deal of dialogue with all policymakers, with the committee that has been leading the new economic and social policy program in Cuba. I would like to start by mentioning 2 points that, in my opinion, are very significant in this process. First of all, the fact that the new economic model has been placed as a priority in the political agenda, and this has been publicly discussed in the Cuban society at large. This has taken many years. It has been a process of many years to establish consensus around new concepts introduced more pragmatically. Secondly, it is also very relevant that a critical analysis has been done in Cuba, from all the experience with the prior economic model, of course, contextualized, but in this critical analysis, the influence of external factors has not been underestimated, and especially the blockade, or what this has meant to prevent economic development. The analysis has led to different options, policy options, in order to undertake a program toward sustainable development. So the new proposal is there, and it is called bringing the Cuban economic model up to date, because in fact there are some essential elements that mean continuity with respect to the socialist model and the social project. But again, there are new concepts, very pragmatic issues, like, for example, the emphasis on growth toward sustainability, the role that foreign investment can play when it is quality level investment, as Enrique has reiterated, in Cuba for growth, for economic growth and development, the coexistence of very different types of property, not only the form where we talk about the private sector and the self-employed, but the proposals of developing the small and medium size companies, the recognition and more active role of the market and prices and the economic system. All of this is important. This should not be considered as in contradistinction to development, but there can be a complementarity of all these factors. And also more emphasis has been placed in the need to transition to a more decentralized model from the standpoint of the publicly owned companies as well as the private ones. I'm not saying that all of these concepts have already become a reality. It is a model under construction. There are policies that are being made as we speak, but there are also other positive signs, as Rebecca has discussed. However, I wanted to focus on some additional aspects. Of course, a lot needs to be done in the macroeconomic level, but there is more fiscal discipline. There is a new tax law. There are restrictions to fiscal deficits. And there is also rationalization of expenditure in the productive area, especially related to bureaucracy. And this has allowed us to keep inflation pressures under control. And of course, this has led or favored growth. In 2015, it was 4%. Now there is, due to the juncture that we're going through, it will be lower, but the GDP grew by 2%. The tourism sector has grown very much. The figures tell us that it has been over 12% as compared to the prior year. And Rebecca also discussed all the successful process of renegotiating the external debt, which has given us access to new prices to increase investment in the structural arena. There's no doubt that all policies toward the state to promote employment are there by giving tax incentives, expansion of asset transfer by the state, by liberalization, the different forms of ownership, and this has led to the fact that 29% of the labor force in the country is in the non-state sector for 0.5 million Cubans, and the in the cooperative or field in 6 years, also tourism. Buildings and lodgings for tourism has grown by 60%, and so the sector is participating in all the different forms of ownership that are being opened up in Cuba. There are other areas where there is some lag, but some adjustments and accommodations are being made. There has been the need to restructure the market, and there is an institutionality that is being strengthened around foreign investment. The special zone, which was visited by CAF, there are more strategic projects, etc. But in general, I think the outlook is quite favorable. But I would like to add two more things in terms of the main challenges we face. At least there are many, but I would like to focus on two that I consider to be very important for economic growth, consolidating macroeconomic stability, and monetary unification is essential to eliminate anti-export biases. You cannot increase long-term the export rate if we can't do this, and we need to do it by closing the gap using quality foreign investment. There is not enough savings in Cuba, and we need to overcome technological and economic lags that still persist. And another issue that I wanted to mention is to deepen structural transformations by focusing on restructuring the incentive system to encourage productivity and competitiveness, having regulated markets, improving planning mechanisms as well. And there's another issue that is very important, and it is and it needs to be promoted from the state, and it is the added value activities, like, for example, the human capital, all the scientific potential in which Cuba is rich. This is all a process that is ongoing. There will be no electroshock therapy. Gradual approach has been very important, and to mitigate social costs and to strengthen consensus. And of course, at this point of international juncture, we will be hopefully able to grow more once we go over this period, and the reestablishment of relations with the United States. We have taken steps to the process of normalization, and I would like to say that the new economic relations will be developed once the blockade is eliminated completely, and when the international communities within the ambit of the United Nations, when this has been achieved, we will be able to establish a true institutionality that will lead to long-term investment and for the benefit of all the corporations, etc. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll be coming back to that. I would ask Andres to tell us a bit about what he thinks about that issue from the side of the United States. But I wanted to ask Mario, as president of the Central Bank of Uruguay. Mario is well acquainted with all of these fiscal and economic issues. Plus, Mario is a great professor of economics. And in our bank, he is playing a very important role. I would ask Mario to do two things. I would ask him to tell us what you think Cuba will be like 5 or 10 years in the future. What would you like to see? And then that counted as 2 questions. Yeah, but another easier question, the role of multilateral banks to help realize this dream. Well, first of all, obviously, I would once again like to express my appreciation to CAF for its invitation, and also I thank CAF for inviting me to this 20th meeting. We hope that this will continue into the future. Hopefully, the elections in the United States will not stand in the way of having future inter-American dialogue meetings, but let's all be optimistic, right? I still have the privilege of having been able to visit Cuba for 18 or 19 years in a row. And the truth is we have seen significant changes. And during that whole period, we have seen changes that are not linear in one direction or another, sometimes turning around, going back to the point of departure. And in the formulation of the 2011 guidelines, I think that for the first time we saw the illusion that they would advance in a more homogeneous direction, not so dependent upon external factors. The decline of socialism that led to that period that euphemistically we call the special period. Then there was an opening up. Then there were links to Venezuela. And so there was some toing and froing in macroeconomic processes and also in terms of monetary relations. But I think that the 2011 guidelines were, perhaps for the first time in this dimension, a more comprehensive formulation with a vision, with an approach that, as Vilma was saying, was self-critical, or at least it was a critical vision, realizing that they had to update the social and economic model for their operations. And this has to be seen as the first steps. Also, it was the initial formulation of something that necessarily has to be a learning process. Learning that also has to overcome a cultural stumbling block, a stumbling block that is even sentimental, because used to, when we talked about Cuba, before beginning to talk, some were overwhelmed by affection, others by a sense of rejection. So that's just part of the reality that we all have, and it stands in the way or facilitates these processes. Now, the guidelines were evaluated 5 years later in the most recent Congress of the Communist Party, and the evaluation done by the Congress, and that is reflected in Raúl Castro's report, is worrisome in the sense that the implementation of the guidelines has been scarce. He talks from the quantitative standpoint, saying that only 21% of the guidelines can be considered to have been implemented. Now, qualitatively, that assessment might be even worse, because not all guidelines are equally important to move ahead in the process of updating that model. I agree that there have been conceptual steps forward. Also, there have been cultural advancements, and now we're realizing that people are talking more about the private sector. No longer are they talking about being self-employed or cuenta propia, which means for your own account. Now, this process now has led to a situation where people are talking about private sector, and that is no minor change from the conceptual or ideological standpoint. But several of the steps forward that were covered by Rebeca and Vilma, and I agree with them. But one thing is, you have to wonder, sometimes these steps forward, they may be bit by bit. Are we truly generating a new basis to update the model and to pave the way to sustained growth? Here I think that we have to look at the guidelines. It's not that we're reinventing an agenda for Cuba. Cuba's agenda has already been defined. The thing is to understand that from that agenda, there are some things that are more pertinent. There are different links in that chain that may either move things forward or hold them back. The relevant problem, or cooperatives too, that is one peculiarity. In Cuba, you have to make certain that you say that the cooperatives are not agricultural. Used to, there were only agricultural cooperatives, so now they have a broader concept and talk about non-agricultural cooperatives. Now, here, is it only a matter of having different property regimes, or is this more related to the rules of the game? Is it more related to incentives? Because if you think that investment instead of 10% will increase to 20 or 25% to lead to sustained growth, then essentially you have to first have incentives for productivity. That is something that we see in Cuba today, where there is a great lag in productivity. And that has to do with technological issues, infrastructure. Also, it has to do with different managerial logic, but basically it has to do with incentive structures. If a company never goes bankrupt, it's truly hard to introduce incentives to encourage productivity. Another euphemism that I love from Cuba is that in all countries we talk about payment chains, right? Well, in Cuba you can see the work being done by Vilma and her team. Most of those people at the university are all women, but they talk about the chain of default. So actually, there's never in a signal on prices or results of what works and what does not work, what needs to be encouraged and what needs to be cast aside. So I realize that there has been progress in the logic having to do with ownership and different ownership modalities, but I think that there is still an important lack of sending the right signals, price signals, signals pertaining to results. Vilma was saying monetary graduality is essential. So if we follow that approach, where we unify monetary issues in Cuba is too difficult, what we're saying is that the process of updating is almost impossible, because without monetary unification in Cuba, there will never be a truly in-depth modernization process for the economy, because we would not allow for price signals that are truly informative, nor would we have signals on results reflecting productivity, creating incentives. Vilma said that actually there is no monetary duality. There are more than two exchange regimes. So that some things have to do with exporting companies. So they assign an exchange rate 1-to-1 for exporting companies, and that is a process that weakens the incentives for exporting companies, and those are the productive companies. So not only is there monetary duality, confusing signals, especially when not reflected in the minimum functioning of the markets, but also, in addition to that, the bias is towards rewarding those who are inefficient and penalizing the most productive companies. So that monetary duality creates perverse incentives. Those companies that come out ahead because of the exchange rate wind up subsidizing the productive companies. So what I'm saying is I welcome this change in ownership regimes that changes the perspective, but what is harder to implement is more the signaling of prices, of the market, incentive structures. That is what investors have to take into account when they make their decisions. And I would conclude by saying that it's been said that there's something that's conceptual, cultural, related to sensitivity, but all of this process is occurring with an important conceptual idea, with a political effort, but the distrust remains intact. The same could be said of the links of this process of pretended normalization. There's a vocation for normalization, but we're far from normalization. Normal relations cannot include embargoes or blockade or an impediment to financial flows, etc. So this is a process that is manifest through will, but the distrust is intact. Despite the magnificent visit of President Obama to Cuba, I think that it made it clear that there are structures of distrust that are hard to remove. But we need to let the markets play. We need to let the price system play freely, as well as incentives, because not everything can be regulated. Not everything can be defined administratively, much less a transitional process, because in any transition, we really don't know what the reaction is going to be if the change is truly a deep one. With Vilma, sometimes we talk, but it's my responsibility what I'm going to say. Hold me accountable. One has already seen transition processes from socialist economies towards integration to international markets and towards allowing markets to operate. In markets where the political system did not guide, did not lead that process, the socialist orientation came to an end. In cases where the political system led the process, there are structures that are successful with a socialist bent. We were talking to friends just recently, and since we were dealing with examples, we said perhaps the difference between what happened in Europe and what happened in Asia, the Soviet Union. The same can be said of Eastern European countries. But if you look at China, the process there was different. And you might say, okay, the Soviet Union, China, they're huge countries. Cuba doesn't have to draw lessons from them. But the case of Vietnam is a jewel. There was a political process that was conducted with guidelines defined every 5 years, pragmatically, spelling out that this was an integration process to international markets, and that it was the process leading towards a more participatory economy working with market signals, but all of this led by the Communist Party of Vietnam. And you can see that since 86, 87, they laid the groundwork. And you can see the congresses of the communist parties in Vietnam in 2001, 2006. And this is a process that is moving ahead quite effectively. And there they got rid of the distrust. Vietnam has a free trade agreement with the United States, with Europe, with China. And nonetheless, it maintains its socialist ideology. And it made sure that opening up to more markets, that process of international integration and international relations maintained its central focus on the well-being of its people. So there, the role of the political system has been strengthened by maintaining that focus. It's clear that liberalization of these things, when the direction of task at hand is lost, then the impact can be negative. But the political involvement can make it possible to progress in this process, taking good care to address well-being and equity. Because, and I'm about to conclude, just one more minute, I have to contradict what they said, because monetary duality was an institutional response at a time of crisis to keep the shock from having redistribution impacts that would be negative at the time. The thing is, that is hard to sustain after many years because it's very costly in financial terms, but especially in terms of incentives, growth, and development. And consequently, monetary unification is essential. And, of course, it may have a cost in the social field, and that's why it has to be offset. It has to be done in a way where the effects are gradual. And to do something gradually, what you need, by definition, is time, and you also need money. And that is where the international banks come in. Also the United States. If we want an orderly process in the monetary unification and in the way that the market and the incentives work in Cuba, there has to be financing support to assure graduality. And the decisions, political decisions, are also essential. Thank you, Mario.
We need some time to respond. Yes, Dan, as you well know, is an extraordinary analyst of the relationship between the United States and Latin America. He's a great analyst in issues of security, and in the White House he has been a special advisor on these issues. He has a clear knowledge on this topic. So I had to ask him, how does he see the end of the embargo being carried out during the rest of the Obama administration? And given the elections, he cannot give us specifically any real issues that will happen, but based on his knowledge, he could tell us his opinion. Yes, thank you for inviting me, and I would like to celebrate and congratulate CAF for being present in Cuba. It is good for CAF, but particularly good for Cuba and for the rest of the region. The CAF has been a protagonist in this process. To talk about the future of the embargo and its coming to an end and implications for the United States. I was educated by Jesuits, and I will talk about three issues of patience and advances and perspectives. And so we talk about progress in diplomacy, in economic issues, and especially in diplomacy in the talks and negotiations. If we take a step back, these are things that reflect more where we were than where we are right now. And this is very relevant, especially related to the private sector. When an American investor looks to Cuba right now, they're not comparing Cuba to Cuba's past, but they're comparing Cuba to the rest of the countries in the region and determining whether there are the conditions there to make profits when investing and doing business there. So these advances, quote unquote, tell us a great deal about the past, but they tell us less about the present, and even less, given the uncertainties around existing around it, about the future. So this has to do with that first leg of that stool, which is patience. The critics, and I'm not one of them, of what President Obama did of going toward normalizing the relationships. And I said last year, well, watch it, because the U.S. and Cuba have never had a normal relationship. So if we talk about normalization, we need to understand context and what normal means. But those who criticize, and there are fewer every day, criticizing President Obama's policy in this regard, they say there are no political changes in Cuba in 18 months. You will have to be patient to maintain a failed policy for 50 years and not to continue in this direction for 18 months. I think the political weight of the United States will maintain the course, or excuse me, the direction, maybe not the same speed, of a policy of having an increasingly normalized relation today than it was yesterday. We have someone who supports, we have one candidate running for the presidency in the United States who is in support of what has been done. And we have another candidate currently whom we have a hard time knowing what he means in any area, but even he has more or less said that he is in favor of going forward with the plans with Cuba. Of course, there is frustration in the political field about the lack of political progress in Cuba. And this is almost there is a total lack of this progress in this area. But there's the understanding, which is part of the basis of what President Obama did, is that we were an obstacle. It was said that we were an obstacle to that change. Yes, it was used as an excuse, but beyond that, if the United States removes itself from that equation, so no longer being an obstacle, then maybe that will help in establishing the Cuban people determining their own destiny. Cuba is less and less relevant regarding the United States, and this will continue to be so. Cuba was used to having to being a protagonist in the public policy in the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the region, but this is something in the past. Cuba is on its way of becoming more and more a Latin American country, and this may be great news on the one hand, but it is a novelty. The only way in which we can go back and have relevancy in the life in the United States and in the United States policy and politics would be if there were massive migration to the United States, but except that it is less and less relevant for the United States on a regular basis. So that takes me back again to the embargo. How are we going to deal with it? Many people think that it's going to be just cold turkey. One day there will be a law passed and that will be the end of the embargo. But frankly, given my last comment, in my opinion, I don't think that's the way it's going to happen. I think it is going to have a gradual process. And frankly, the embargo consists of two things, basically, these days. Three, actually. Access to credit, changing travel law instead of doing it administratively, and also the transition terms, which are absurd. The first one, I think, is the hardest to achieve, the credit-related one, because this is of clear advantage to the Cuban government, and politically this will continue to be more difficult. Second one will be easier to achieve, the travel issues, because it has already happened de facto. And secondly, it clearly benefits American people, and it is politically easier to pull off. And the third will die with one of the other two. I don't think it has a great deal of relevance. So that being said, our political system does not work on things that are deeply important for the future of the American Republic. To think that it will work to remove this topic from the middle in an issue that is less and less relevant for politics in the United States, well, I don't know. It will require us to be patient once again. Thank you. Thank you. We have very little time left. I think they're going to take away the mic. But I would like to make a comment here. What I see is that, yes, there has been progress, and significant progress has been made, and the process will go along. Every day brings its own concern. And what Latin America needs to do is to accompany the process, to go along with it, so that all those restrictions and all those obstacles be overcome in a positive manner, eventually and finally, for the benefit of the Cuban people. I would dare dream. As Minister of Foreign Relations in Colombia, it behooved me to sign Cuba's entering Aladi, which was the child of Alalc. I think Gustavo was with us back then, and it was a symbol that things could start changing for Cuba. So Cuba joined Aladi. My dream is to see Cuba becoming a shareholder in CAF. I think this would help greatly for strategic, infrastructure, energy, all of these topics, all the structural reforms that need to happen in Cuba. Having said that, people are mad at me because I don't conclude this, but I cannot finish without asking Vilma, they can cut my head off, but I am going to do this. I'm going to ask Vilma and Rebecca to have the last word. Yes, I am a Cuban expert indeed. This exchange has been great with the central bank, with the University of the Republic, and there are many issues where we have received technical assistance that has been also quite important. And we have had the opportunity to discuss these issues. I don't have the time now. It would be great. But I would like to finish here without saying that I agree that monetary duality, and in fact there is a proposal from academia, not only Cuba, but from other countries as well, that there is a vision that we have, and it became a book published through the central bank, where we said that while this scheme played its role in leading to growth, and we agree that it was good, but this barrier has to be broken. We have taken steps now, and the most important one is in this direction. Very few countries have been asked to do a monetary reform without having provided credit. You could devaluate the exchange rate in the business sector, not unifying the rate of exchange. I would love to talk about this. This was the topic of my thesis, but well, we're not going to say that everything is going to be perfect overnight. It's not viable. A recession would not be the thing to do. It wouldn't be good for the private sector. This is not part of what people want. It's not part of the social consensus. However, we could start eliminating certain biases that exist. We are not going to penalize the private sector. We need to be more integrated in the road toward unification. And that's what I wanted to say. I think it is very clear in the guidelines. I am very optimistic regarding the future. I also wanted to mention something that is very significant, and it is the sequence. Maybe we wanted to be too ambitious in the different guidelines that we wanted to include. And then now we're thinking more in terms of a long-term agenda so that we can include all these items. The sequence of events is quite relevant also. And finally, a comment about what Dan said. Of course, we have our differences, and I understand this is no news. He has explained things from a pragmatic point of view, but we insist that mutual respect, respecting our differences, just the same way that the United States has relationships with other countries, many others, where they have no expectations, or at least there is not a conditioned expectation. This is what Cuba emphasizes. They want to be able to have the embargo lifted so that they can rebuild their institutions based on economic relations that will respect the sovereign rights, the self-determination rights, and ultimately this will lead to continue to respect our differences and forge ahead.
I don't disagree with Mario in terms of the need, nor do I disagree with what Vilma said about the exchange rates. We all know that foreign investment and the normalization of price signals, etc., depends on exchange unification. Now, this doesn't apply only to Cuba. It's not that this is a process that has only happened in Cuba and not in other countries. There are some things that are specific and related to Cuba, and other things are part of economic discussions on other countries too. What I do say is that the conditions for monetary unification are important and need to be taken into account, because otherwise the effect may be the opposite one from what we seek. And something that has happened in Cuba, a lot has depended on social and political conditions not being in place to maintain the reforms that were made at a given point. So I think it's very important, and perhaps since I come from Costa Rica, I can say this, because we were told once and again in the 80s and the 90s that we were the slow reformers. We were the slow reformers in the region. But what did happen in our country is that we did reforms more slowly, but we never backed off. We stayed the course, and I think that that is important in Cuba and in any other country. My second point is, in economy, often we talk about the direction. Here we're not talking about the right direction. It seems to everyone that there is consensus regarding the direction. But the second discussion amongst economists is the magnitude of a change. the magnitude is as important as the direction. So what I'm saying is that right now, when we have an economy that is so dependent on external conditions like Cuba, this is not the right time. So the question is, why? Because it's trade partners that have allowed it to grow in recent years are in crisis. That's Brazil, that's Venezuela. So Cuba depended on other partners. And right now, to speak of exchange unification and having it occur quickly, I don't think that the conditions are in place. And then, a third element, none of our countries has done a unification, and I agree with what was said here, without sizable outside funding. So that has to be there for that decision to be made. That's something that has to be dealt with because they need significant external funding to be able to do that unification. So the question is, are we going to fall? And that is the danger. Are we going to fall into that discussion of what comes first, the chicken or the egg? There has to be monetary unification. It is essential for next steps in Cuba, but there has to be external support so that that unification can take place without having the harmful effects that it might. If some people say that there is no better time than the time of crisis to do all reforms. And what worries me is that when people say that or pressure in that direction, what we see is often a backing off from reforms without continuing our path of stable reforms. Dan, 20 seconds. To clarify between analysis and opinion, I agree with the appeal of President Obama and Secretary Clinton calling for an end to the embargo. I was talking analytically of how I think that can occur or not, but that it needs to happen, yes, definitely. Well, unfortunately, I have been discriminated against, but Mario, you can't say that. You know more about Cuba than anyone else. Thank you to the audience.